Stop touching that piano. You'll break it. The words cut clean through the polished air of the concert hall, sharp enough to make a little girl freeze mid-step as her small hand tightened around her father's sleeve. And for a moment, all the soft murmurs and polite laughter in the room seemed to lean in, waiting to see what the janitor would do next. Daniel Harper didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look offended. He simply rested his hand gently over his daughter Sophie's fingers and guided them away from the glossy black grand piano, the kind that cost more than he would make in 10 years, his movements calm, deliberate, like a man who had long ago decided that dignity didn't need an audience to exist. But the whispers still came, quiet at first, then growing just enough to sting. Some people don't know their place, one voice said, followed by a soft chuckle that echoed a little too loudly under the high ceilings, and Sophie looked up at him, her wide eyes searching, confused more than hurt. "Daddy, why can't we touch it?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath, and Daniel paused, just for a second, the kind of pause that holds a lifetime inside it, before offering a small, steady smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because it's not ours, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice low, even, carrying a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. And he turned back to his work, pushing the mop across the marble floor in long, even strokes, the faint squeak of rubber against stone filling. The silence he chose to keep, fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead while the scent of polish and expensive perfume hung in the air like something he wasn't meant to belong to. But there was something about the way he moved, something controlled, something precise, as if every step, every breath, every quiet decision had been practiced long before this moment. And Sophie didn't let go of his sleeve, not even as the crowd drifted past them in tailored suits and polished shoes, not even as another voice muttered, "You'd think he'd teach her better." And Daniel heard it, of course he did, but he didn't respond, because he had learned that some battles weren't meant to be fought out loud, and some truths didn't need defending, they just needed time. And as he wrung out the mop into a bucket of gray water, watching the ripples settle slowly back into stillness, his reflection flickered for just a second, distorted, almost unrecognizable, like a man the world had already decided it understood, until somewhere behind him, a single piano key was pressed by accident, a soft, imperfect note that lingered in the air just long enough to remind him of something he had buried, something he had promised himself he would never return to. And for the briefest moment, his hand stopped moving, the room stilling in a way no one noticed yet, because no one there knew that the quiet janitor standing in worn boots and a faded shirt was the only person in that entire building who could make that piano fall completely silent. The note lingered longer than it should have, soft but undeniable, and Daniel Harper did not turn around right away. Because some moments were not meant to be rushed, they were meant to settle, like dust in quiet light. And Sophie looked at him again, this time not with confusion, but with something closer to curiosity. "Daddy, you heard that, right?" she whispered, her voice careful, as if the room itself might be listening. And Daniel nodded once, slow, controlled, before dipping the mop back into the bucket and continuing his work as though nothing had changed. But something had, even if no one else could feel it yet. The crowd moved on, conversations rising again, polished shoes clicking across marble, laughter returning to its practiced rhythm. Yet Sophie did not move, her eyes drifting back to the piano, then to her father, then back again, connecting something she could not yet explain. "You used to play, didn't you?" she asked, and the question landed heavier than the one before, heavier because it carried a kind of quiet knowing. And Daniel's hand paused again, just for a fraction of a second, before he exhaled slowly. "A long time ago," he said, his tone steady but distant, like a memory he kept at arm's length. And Sophie stepped closer, her small sneakers barely making a sound against the floor. "Why did you stop?" she asked, and this time, the silence stretched, not empty but full, filled with something unspoken, something that did not belong in a place like this. And Daniel did not answer right away because the truth was not simple. It never was. It lived somewhere between loss and choice, between love and letting go. And instead, he reached down and adjusted the strap of her backpack, a quiet gesture, grounding. "Because some things are not meant to be held onto forever," he said gently. though the words felt heavier than he let them sound, and Sophie frowned slightly, not fully understanding but sensing the weight anyway. And before she could ask more, a sharp voice cut through again from across the hall. "Hey, janitor, we are not paying you to stand around." And a few nearby heads turned, some with amusement, others with indifference, and Daniel simply nodded once. No resistance, no irritation, just acknowledgement. And he guided Sophie toward the side of the room, where the light was softer, where the noise felt a little further away, and as he resumed his steady rhythm, mop gliding across the floor in quiet arcs, Sophie watched him differently now, not just as her father, but as someone she was beginning to discover, someone the world did not seem to recognize. And in the reflection of the polished marble, she saw it, just for a moment, the way his hands moved, the way his posture held, not like someone small, not like someone invisible, but like someone who had once stood somewhere else entirely, somewhere brighter, somewhere louder, somewhere people did not laugh. And the thought stayed with her, quiet but persistent, as the day moved forward and the hall slowly emptied, until all that remained was the faint hum of lights, the soft scent of polish, and a father who had chosen silence over explanation, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew the right moment had not yet arrived. The hall was nearly empty now, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than noise, and Daniel Harper moved slower without realizing it, each pass of the mop stretching just a little longer, as if time itself had softened around him, while Sophie sat on the edge of a low wooden bench, her legs swinging gently, her eyes still drifting back to the piano across the room. "Daddy," she said again, softer this time, not asking but remembering, and Daniel glanced up briefly, just enough to meet her eyes before looking away, because there was something in that look he was not ready to hold on to for too long. The late afternoon light slipped through the tall windows, casting long gold lines across the polished floor, catching in the faint scratches on the piano's surface, marks left by years of hands that came and went, admired and applauded, and yet none of them stayed. None of them carried the weight that Daniel did. Not anymore. "Do you miss it?" Sophie asked after a moment, her voice careful, respectful in a way children rarely needed to be, and Daniel exhaled slowly, setting the mop against the wall, his hands resting lightly on the handle as if it anchored him. "Missing something does not always mean you should go back to it," he replied, calm, measured, but there was a quiet truth underneath it that even Sophie could feel, and she nodded, though she did not fully understand. "Not yet." From somewhere down the hallway, a door opened, with a soft click, followed by the echo of heels approaching, steady, confident, the kind of sound that carried intention, and Daniel straightened slightly, instinct more than reaction, while Sophie turned her head toward the sound, curiosity lighting her face. And then she appeared, the same woman from earlier, the one whose presence had shifted the room without effort, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were searching. She slowed as she stepped into the open space, her gaze moving across the room until it landed on the piano, then past it, finally settling on Daniel. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to mean something. "You were here earlier," she said, her voice even, not accusing, not warm, simply certain, and Daniel nodded once, respectful, contained. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his tone steady, and Sophie watched between them, sensing something she could not name, something quiet but important. The woman stepped closer, her heels softening against the rug near the piano, and she rested her hand lightly on its edge, her fingers brushing the surface as if greeting something familiar. "That note," she said after a pause. Someone touched the keys, and her eyes flicked briefly towards Sophie before returning to Daniel. Not harsh, not judgmental, just observant, and Daniel did not deny it, did not explain. He simply met her gaze for a second longer than before, then looked away, choosing silence. Again, because silence had always been his way of holding the things that mattered most. Sophie shifted on the bench, her voice small but clear. "He used to play," she said, and the words landed gently but carried farther than she realized. And Daniel closed his eyes for just a breath, not in frustration, not in anger, but in acceptance, because some truths, once spoken, could not be folded back into quiet. And when he opened them again, the room felt different, Not louder, not brighter, just waiting, as if something had finally been set in motion. Something that would not stop until the silence he had chosen was no longer enough. The air shifted in a way that could not be seen, but could be felt, like the moment before rain touches the ground. And Daniel Harper stood still, not frozen, just aware, because the woman's eyes were no longer casually observing. They were studying, measuring something beneath the surface. And Sophie's words still lingered between them, light but irreversible. He used to play. The woman repeated softly, not as a question, but as a recognition waiting to be confirmed, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for just a second before returning to its quiet steadiness. That was a long time ago, he said, his tone even, respectful, but distant enough to close the door without slamming it, and the woman did not push, not immediately. She simply nodded once, her fingers tracing the edge of the piano with a familiarity that did not belong to a stranger. Some things do not leave you, she replied, her voice calm, almost reflective, and Sophie watched them both, her small hands resting in her lap, sensing the weight of words she could not fully understand but somehow trusted. A faint hum of the building's ventilation system filled the silence, steady and low, and outside, the last light of the day stretched across the glass, fading slowly into evening, while inside, something quieter, something deeper, began to unfold. "What is your name?" the woman asked after a moment, her gaze returning to Daniel, direct but not unkind, and he hesitated just briefly, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if names had once meant more than they did. "Now, Daniel," he said, simply, and she nodded again, as if placing the name somewhere important, somewhere it might matter later. "I am Claire," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, not introducing herself, but offering a piece of context without explanation, and then her attention shifted, just slightly, towards Sophie. "And you must be the reason he keeps showing up every day," she added, a faint warmth touching her voice, and Sophie smiled shyly. "I am Sophie," she said, her voice soft but proud, and Daniel's expression softened for just a moment, the kind of moment that passed quickly but meant everything. Claire looked between them, then back at the piano, her hand resting more firmly now, as if grounding herself in something familiar. "We have a performance here tomorrow night," she said, her tone returning to something more formal, more composed. "A full house, donors, press, the kind of event where everything must be perfect." And she paused, not for effect, but because what came next required precision. "This instrument matters," she added quietly, her fingers pressing lightly against the keys without sound, and Daniel nodded once, understanding without needing explanation. "I take care of it," he said, and there was no pride in his voice, no claim, just a simple statement of responsibility, and Claire studied him again, this time longer, as if aligning what she saw with something she remembered, something just out of reach. "Do you?" she asked, not doubting, but inviting something more, and Daniel met her gaze, steady, composed. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and the room fell still again, not empty, not silent, but waiting, as if even the air understood that something had just shifted slightly out of its ordinary place. And Claire stepped back from the piano, her expression unreadable now, but her eyes lingered on Daniel for just a second longer than necessary, as if she had just noticed something no one else had, something quiet, something dangerous to ignore. And then she turned to leave, her heels echoing softly against the floor, leaving behind a space that felt different than before, and Sophie looked up at her father. Again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, she knows something." And Daniel did not answer right away, because deep down, he knew she was right, and for the first time in a long time, silence did not feel like enough. The echo of Claire's footsteps faded slowly down the hallway, each step softer than the last, until the building returned to its familiar quiet. But it was not the same quiet as before. It carried something unresolved, something waiting beneath the surface, and Daniel Harper stood still for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly on the handle of the mop as if he needed something steady to hold on to, while Sophie watched him closely, her small face thoughtful in a way that did not belong to someone her age. "Daddy, why did she look at you like that?" she asked, her voice gentle, careful, and Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the lungs. Some people see things others do not, he replied, his tone calm but distant, and Sophie tilted her head slightly, not fully understanding, but sensing the truth behind the words, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence is not empty. It is full of things that do not need to be said yet. The overhead lights hummed softly as Daniel returned to his work, pushing the mop across the floor in long, quiet strokes, each movement measured, each step controlled. But there was a subtle difference now, something just beneath the surface, like a rhythm he could not quite ignore, and Sophie slid off the bench, her sneakers brushing softly against the polished marble as she walked toward the piano again, slower this time, more aware, her eyes tracing its shape, its presence, as if it held answers she could not yet reach. "Can I just look at it?" she asked, turning back toward him, and Daniel hesitated, not because of the piano, but because of what it represented, the memories tied to it, the part of himself he had kept buried for so long. And then he nodded once, a small permission. "Just look," he said gently, and Sophie smiled, stepping closer, her reflection faint in the glossy surface as she leaned in, careful, respectful, like she had learned something important without being told. Daniel watched her from a distance, his grip tightening slightly around the mop handle, because in that moment, it was not the piano he was seeing, it was a different room, a different time, a smaller version of Sophie sitting beside someone who used to sing softly in the evenings, someone who believed music could fill the spaces that words could not. And the memory came and went like a quiet wave, leaving behind something heavier than before. "You used to play for Mom, didn't you?" Sophie's voice broke through gently, not accusing, not pushing, just asking, and Daniel's eyes lowered for a brief second, enough to acknowledge the truth without fully stepping into it. "Yes," he said, quietly, and the word carried more than its weight. It carried everything he had not said, everything he had chosen to leave behind. From somewhere near the entrance, a clipboard snapped shut, followed by a voice calling out instructions about tomorrow's event, names, times, rehearsals, the kind of organized urgency that filled spaces like this when something important was coming. And Sophie turned toward the sound, then back to her father. "Are we coming tomorrow?" she asked, and Daniel paused, just for a moment, before answering. "We will be here," he said, because that part was certain, it always was. But what he did not say, what he could not yet say, was that tomorrow would not be like today, because something had already begun to shift, something quiet but undeniable. And as he glanced once more at the piano, then at Sophie, then toward the hallway where Claire had disappeared, he knew, without needing to explain it, that whatever silence he had been holding on to for years was not going to last much longer. The night settled slowly over the city, and by the time the last staff member checked their clipboard and switched off the lobby lights, the grand hall had transformed into something quieter, something more honest, the kind of silence that did not judge or expect, and Daniel Harper moved through it with a familiarity that felt almost invisible, his footsteps soft against the polished floor as Sophie walked beside him, her small hand brushing lightly against his arm. "It feels different now," she whispered, glancing around at the empty rows of seats, the stage, the piano resting alone under a single dim light, and Daniel nodded slightly. "It always does when people leave," he said, his voice low, calm, because empty rooms had a way of telling the truth that crowded ones never could. Sophie looked at the piano again, then back at him, her eyes brighter now, more certain. "No one is watching," she said, not as a question, but as an invitation, and Daniel paused mid-step, his gaze following hers to the stage, the instrument waiting in stillness, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow, not to the building, not even to the room, but to that single point of quiet possibility. "We should go," he said gently after a breath, but his feet did not move, and Sophie noticed, of course she did, because children often see the truth before adults admit it. "You always say that when you are about to do something you are afraid of," she replied softly, her voice carrying no judgment, only observation, and Daniel let out a faint breath that almost became a smile, because she was not wrong. The air felt still, the kind of stillness that listens, and slowly, almost without deciding, Daniel stepped forward, one step, then another, his worn shoes meeting the wooden edge of the stage, the soft creak beneath him echoing lightly into the empty seats. And Sophie followed, her steps quieter, her presence steady, as if she understood that this moment did not need to be rushed. He stood beside the piano now, close enough to see his reflection in its polished surface, older, more tired than he remembered, but still there, still real, and his hand hovered just above the keys, not touching, not yet, because some distances are not measured in inches, they are measured in years, in choices, in things left behind. "It is just a piano," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Sophie shook her head gently. "No, it is not," she replied, and her words landed softly but firmly, like a truth that had been waiting to be said. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, the faint memory of another voice, another night, another promise flickering through his mind, and when he opened them again, the room felt even quieter than before, as if it were holding its breath, and slowly, carefully, he lowered his fingers onto the keys, not pressing, just resting, feeling the weight, the shape, the familiarity he had tried so hard to forget, and for a second, nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just stillness, until Sophie whispered, barely audible, "It is okay." And that was enough, just enough, for his fingers to press down gently, releasing a single note into the empty hall, soft, steady, and impossibly clear, a sound that did not belong to the past anymore, a sound that had found its way back, and as it echoed lightly into the silence, something inside Daniel shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because some returns do not ask for permission, they simply happen, and in that quiet moment, with no audience, no judgment, no expectations, the first note became more than just sound, it became the beginning of something he could no longer hold back. The note did not fade the way ordinary sounds do. It stayed, suspended in the air like it had something to say, and Daniel Harper felt it more than he heard it, a quiet vibration that moved through his chest, steady and familiar, and for a moment he did not move his hands because he knew what would happen next if he did. Sophie stood beside him, her eyes wide but calm, not surprised, not confused, just present, as if she had been waiting for this all along. "That sounded different," she whispered, her voice soft enough to belong to the silence. And Daniel let out a slow breath, his fingers still resting on the keys. "It always does the first time," he replied, not looking at her, because he was not speaking to the room anymore. He was speaking to something deeper, something he had kept quiet for far too long. His right hand shifted slightly, pressing another key, then another, not a melody yet, just a sequence, testing, remembering, and the piano responded without hesitation, each note clear, balanced, as if it had been waiting too, and Sophie stepped closer, her small hand resting lightly against the edge of the instrument, feeling the vibration travel through the wood. "You did not forget," she said gently, and Daniel almost smiled, not because it was true, but because it was not that simple. "Some things do not forget you," he answered, his voice steady, and this time, he let his fingers move freely, slowly at first, then with more certainty, the notes beginning to connect, to form something recognizable, something that carried weight, memory, and meaning. The empty hall seemed to lean in, the walls catching the sound and holding it, reflecting it back in a way that made it feel fuller, warmer, and Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, not because she understood the music, but because she felt it, and sometimes feeling is enough. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly as he played, the tension that had lived in him for years easing just enough to let something real come through, not perfect, not polished, but honest, and that honesty filled the room in a way nothing else had that day. "You used to play this for Mom," Sophie said softly, and the words landed gently, not breaking the moment, but deepening it, and Daniel nodded once, his gaze fixed on the keys. "She liked this one," he said, his voice quieter now, and for a second, the past and the present existed in the same space, not colliding, not competing, just existing side by side. The melody grew, not louder, but fuller, more certain, each note finding its place without force, without hesitation, and Daniel realized something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. He was not playing for an audience. He was not playing to prove anything. He was simply playing because the music was still there, and Sophie was there, and that was enough. Then, just as the melody began to settle into something complete, something whole, a faint sound echoed from the far end of the hall, a door closing softly, distant but unmistakable, and Daniel's fingers paused mid-motion, the final note hanging in the air, unfinished, unresolved, and Sophie opened her eyes, looking toward the sound, then back at him, her voice barely a whisper. Someone is here. And Daniel did not turn right away, because part of him already knew, part of him had felt it before the sound even came, that the moment he had tried to keep hidden, the moment he thought belonged only to silence, had just been heard by someone else. And this time, there would be no going back. The final note had not yet settled when the presence behind them became undeniable, not loud, not abrupt, but steady, like someone who had been listening long enough to understand what they were hearing. And Daniel Harper slowly lifted his hands from the keys, not in panic, not in guilt, but in quiet acceptance, because some moments are not meant to stay hidden once they have been revealed. Sophie turned first, her small frame shifting toward the back of the hall, her eyes searching through the dim light until they found her, standing just beyond the edge of the stage, still, composed, and watching. Claire did not step forward immediately. She did not interrupt. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on Daniel with a focus that felt different than before, not curious, not casual, but certain, as if something she had suspected had just been confirmed without a single word. "That was not something you forget," she said finally, her voice calm, measured, carrying easily through the empty space. And Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, his shoulders relaxed but his posture grounded, because he knew there was no reason to deny it now, no reason to return to the version of silence he had been holding on to. And slowly, he turned toward her, meeting her eyes with the same quiet steadiness he had shown all day. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice even, and Sophie looked between them, sensing the shift, the weight of what was happening, though she could not fully name it. Claire took a few steps closer, her heels softer now against the stage as she moved into the light, and for a brief second, her attention flickered to Sophie, a small acknowledgement, before returning to Daniel. "You played like someone who did not stop," she continued, not accusing, not praising, simply stating what she had heard. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for just a moment before returning. "I stopped performing," he said, choosing his words carefully because they mattered. Now, more than they had before, and Claire's expression shifted slightly, not surprised, but interested, as if the distinction meant more than it seemed. "That is not the same thing," she replied, her tone thoughtful, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of recognition that did not need explanation. Sophie stepped closer to her father, her hand gently touching his arm, grounding him, reminding him of what mattered most, and Daniel glanced down at her. Briefly, a softness returning to his expression before he looked back at Claire. "It was enough," he said quietly, and Claire studied him again, longer this time, as if measuring something deeper than skill, something beyond talent, something closer to character. And then, without warning, she asked, "Will you be here tomorrow night?" And the question landed differently than expected, not as a casual inquiry, but as something intentional, something placed carefully. Daniel did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because he understood that this question carried more than it seemed. And Sophie looked up at him, her eyes steady, her presence quiet but strong, and after a moment, he nodded once. "Yes," he said simply, and Claire held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if something had just been decided, not spoken, not explained, just set into motion. She stepped back slightly, her expression returning to its composed calm. But her eyes remained different now, sharper, more certain, and as she turned to leave once again, her voice came back, softer this time. "Good," she said, and the word lingered in the air longer than expected, because it was not just acknowledgement, it was anticipation. And as the door closed quietly behind her, Daniel looked back at the piano, then at Sophie, and for the first time since the music had returned, he understood that tomorrow would not be about silence anymore. It would be about something far more difficult to hold on to, being seen the hall felt different after she left. Not louder, not brighter, but heavier in a way that lingered beneath the surface, and Daniel Harper did not move for a long moment, his eyes resting on the piano keys as if they held answers he was not sure he wanted, while Sophie stood quietly beside him, her presence steady, her small hand still resting against his arm. "She is going to ask you to play," she said softly, not guessing, not wondering, but knowing, and Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more weight than sound. "Maybe," he replied, though the word felt thinner than the truth, because deep down, he already understood what Claire's question meant, what tomorrow was beginning to shape into. The lights above dimmed slightly as the building shifted into its night setting, the soft hum of electricity lowering, shadows stretching longer across the empty rows, and Daniel stood up from the bench, his movements calm but deliberate, stepping away from the piano, as if distance might restore something familiar, something safe, and Sophie followed him without hesitation, her steps quiet, her gaze thoughtful. "Why did you stop performing?" she asked again, this time not as a child asking, but as someone seeking understanding, and Daniel paused near the edge of the stage, his back to the empty seats, his eyes drifting across the space where people would be tomorrow, where expectations would fill every corner. "Because sometimes being seen is harder than being alone," he said, his voice low, steady, and Sophie tilted her head slightly, absorbing the words in her own way. "But you are not alone," she replied. Simple, certain, and Daniel looked down at her, something soft returning to his expression, something real. "I know," he said quietly, and for a moment, that was enough. They made their way toward the side exit, the door creaking softly as Daniel pushed it open, the cool night air meeting them gently, carrying the distant sound of traffic, the kind of ordinary noise that grounded everything back into reality. And Sophie stepped outside first, taking a small breath. "It smells like rain," she said, looking up at the dark sky, and Daniel followed, closing the door behind them. The hall now sealed again in its quiet, but not untouched, not unchanged. As they walked toward the parking lot, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the pavement, Sophie glanced up at him once more. "If she asks you to play, will you say yes?" And the question lingered between them, simple on the surface, but carrying everything underneath. And Daniel did not answer right away, because the truth was not a single word. It was a weight, a choice, a line between who he had been and who he had decided to become. And finally, he spoke. "I do not know," he admitted, honest, calm, and Sophie nodded, not disappointed, not confused, just understanding in a way that felt older than her years. The night stretched quietly around them as they reached the car, and Daniel opened the door for her, watching as she climbed in, her movements small but certain, and before he closed it, she looked up at him one last time. "You sounded happy," she said softly, and the words stayed with him longer than anything else that day, because happiness was not something he had expected to feel again, not there, not like that. And as he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, his gaze lifted briefly toward the building behind them, its windows dark, its presence silent, but holding something new inside, something that would not stay hidden much longer. And as he started the engine, the quiet hum filling the space around him, Daniel realized that tomorrow was no longer just another day of work. It was a moment waiting to happen, a moment that would ask him to choose, not between silence and sound, but between staying unseen or finally stepping into the light. The next evening arrived without ceremony, just a slow build of quiet tension that settled into Daniel Harper's chest long before he stepped through the doors of the concert hall. And the moment he entered, he knew everything had changed. The same marble floors, the same high ceilings, but now filled with movement, voices layered over one another, staff rushing with clipboards, lights brighter, sharper, the kind that did not allow shadows to hide in the corners. And Sophie stayed close to him, her hand lightly holding his sleeve as she looked around, taking it all in. "There are so many people," she whispered, and Daniel nodded, his gaze steady, observing, adjusting, because this was not the quiet space from the night before. This was a stage waiting to be filled. "Stay with me," he said gently, and Sophie nodded back, her trust simple and complete. The sound of a piano being tested echoed faintly across the hall. Not music, just fragments, scales, notes without feeling, and Daniel's eyes flicked toward the stage for a brief second before he turned away, picking up his mop from the side closet, slipping back into the role. The world expected him to play, moving along the edges, unnoticed, unseen, and yet not quite invisible anymore. "Hey, you!" A voice called from behind him, sharp, impatient, and Daniel turned slightly to see a coordinator gesturing toward a section of the floor. "We need this spotless before guests arrive. No streaks," the man said, not unkind, but dismissive, and Daniel simply nodded once. "Yes, sir," he replied. Calm, controlled, and Sophie watched quietly, her expression thoughtful, because she had seen something different now, something the others did not see. The room continued to fill, conversations rising, laughter echoing, the soft clink of glasses beginning to replace the silence that once lived there, and Daniel worked steadily, each movement precise, not rushed, not hesitant, just consistent, like a rhythm he understood better than anything else. And Sophie sat once again on the edge of the same bench from the day before, her eyes drifting between the crowd and the stage, waiting without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. Then, without announcement, without introduction, Claire appeared near the front of the room, her presence cutting through the noise without needing to raise her voice, her posture composed, her expression focused, and as she spoke quietly with a group of organizers, her gaze lifted, scanning the room, searching, and when her eyes found Daniel, there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty, just recognition. She moved toward him, her steps measured, deliberate, and Sophie noticed first, her small voice barely above a whisper. "She is coming." And Daniel did not stop what he was doing, not immediately, because some moments are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to arrive. And when Claire reached him, she did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply spoke, her voice calm but carrying something firm beneath it. "Daniel," she said, using his name as if it belonged in this space now. And he looked up, meeting her gaze without resistance. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, steady, and for a brief second, the noise of the room seemed to fade, not because it stopped, but because it no longer mattered. Claire held his gaze, then glanced briefly toward the stage, then back at him. "We have a problem," she said, not dramatic, not urgent, but precise, and Daniel remained still, waiting, and she continued. "Our pianist did not show up." And the words landed quietly, but heavily, and Sophie's eyes widened just slightly as she looked between them, understanding before anything else was said, and Claire's next words came slower, more intentional. "I need someone who can play not just the notes, but the meaning behind them." And she paused, letting the moment settle, letting the truth stand on its own, before adding, "I heard you last night." And the room, full of voices and movement, suddenly felt very far away, because in that moment, everything had narrowed down to a single question that had already been answered before it was even asked, and Daniel Harper, standing in worn shoes on a polished floor, understood that the choice he had been avoiding was no longer his. To delay, the words settled between them with a weight that did not need to be repeated, and for a moment, Daniel Harper did not respond, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well, and Sophie looked up at him, her eyes steady, her presence quiet but unwavering, while Claire waited, not impatient, not pressing, simply certain, as if she had already seen the answer before he spoke it. "I am not the person you are looking for," Daniel said finally, his voice calm, respectful, but firm enough to create distance, and Claire did not react the way others might have. She did not argue, she did not insist, she simply tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that felt deeper than disagreement. "No," she replied softly. "You are exactly the person I am looking for." And the room around them continued to move, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, footsteps echoing, but none of it seemed to reach them now, because something quieter, something more important, had taken its place. Daniel glanced briefly toward the stage, the piano sitting under the lights, waiting, then back at Claire. "I clean floors," he said, not as a complaint, not as an excuse, but as a truth he had lived by, and Claire nodded, once, acknowledging it without dismissing it. "And last night, You played something no one here can, she answered, her tone even, and Sophie's hand tightened slightly around her father's sleeve, not out of fear, but out of belief, and Daniel felt it, that quiet support, that simple trust, and it made the moment heavier, not lighter. People are expecting a performance, he continued, his gaze steady, something practiced, something prepared, and Claire took a small step closer, her voice lowering just enough to carry intention without drawing attention. They are expecting something real, she said, and the words landed differently, not as pressure, but as invitation, and Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, searching for something he could not name, something that would allow him to stay where he was, to remain unseen. But it was not there, because Claire was not asking him to become someone else. She was asking him to stop pretending he was not who he already was. Sophie shifted slightly beside him, her voice soft but clear. You said some things do not forget you, she reminded him, and Daniel's eyes closed briefly, just long enough to feel the truth of that. The music, the memory, the part of himself he had tried to leave behind, all of it still there, still waiting. When he opened his eyes again, the noise of the room seemed to fade just a little, not gone, but distant, and he looked at Claire, then at the stage, then down at Sophie, and something inside him settled, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. I will not play for them, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, and Claire did not interrupt. She simply listened. I will play for her, he added, his hand resting gently on Sophie's shoulder, and for the first time, a faint shift crossed Claire's expression, not surprise, not relief, but understanding, as if that had been the answer all along. She nodded once, stepping back slightly, giving the space he needed. That is all I am asking, she said quietly, and the moment held, just long enough to become something real, something irreversible, because the decision had been made, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet clarity that does not need approval. And as Daniel turned toward the stage, Sophie walking beside him, the crowd still unaware, still caught in their own conversations, something began to change, not in the room, not yet, but in the space between who he had been and who he was about to become. The room did not notice at first, not really, because rooms like this are trained to notice only what they expect, and a man in worn shoes stepping onto a polished stage was not something they were prepared to see. But Daniel Harper did not rush, did not look around for approval. He simply walked forward with the same quiet steadiness he had carried all day, Sophie beside him, her small hand brushing lightly against his sleeve until they reached the piano, and for a moment, the contrast hung in the air, tailored suits and pressed dresses in the audience, soft murmurs and polite laughter, and at the center of it all, a janitor standing where he did not seem to belong. Sir, that area is restricted. A voice called from somewhere near the front, low but firm, and a few heads turned, curiosity flickering across faces that had not yet decided whether this was a mistake or something intentional. And Daniel paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment, then continued forward without argument, because he was not there to explain himself, and Sophie stayed close, her presence quiet but unshaken. Claire stepped forward then, just enough to be seen, just enough to shift the direction of attention. It is all right, she said calmly, her voice cutting through the noise without needing to rise, and that was enough. Not because of volume, but because of certainty, and the room adjusted, not fully understanding, but no longer resisting. Daniel reached the piano and rested his hand lightly on its edge, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingers, grounding himself in something real, something familiar. And he did not sit right away. He simply stood there for a second, the weight of the room settling around him, expectations, judgments, questions he could almost hear without anyone speaking them. And Sophie looked up at him, her eyes steady, her voice soft. I am right here, she whispered, and that was enough, just enough, to quiet everything else. He sat down slowly, his posture calm, his movements precise, not performing, not presenting, just present, and the room began to shift, not loudly, but noticeably, conversations lowering, glances turning, curiosity replacing dismissal, because something about the way he carried himself did not match what they had assumed. And that quiet contradiction began to draw attention in a way no announcement ever Could. Daniel placed his hands over the keys, not pressing, just resting, the same way he had the night before. And for a moment, nothing happened, the kind of pause that feels longer than it is, the kind that tests patience. And somewhere in the audience, a faint whisper rose, uncertain, questioning, but it faded quickly because something about the silence felt intentional, not empty. And then, without warning, his fingers moved, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, and the first note rang out, clear, steady, carrying across the room with a presence that could not be ignored. The effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned. Fully now, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because the sound was not simple, it was not casual, it held weight, control, something practiced but not rehearsed, something real. And Daniel did not look up, did not acknowledge the shift. He simply continued, each note following the last with quiet certainty, building not in volume, but in meaning, and the room responded the only way it could, not with applause, not with words, but with something far more powerful, silence. The silence did not break when the music began to settle. It deepened, stretching across the room like something sacred, something no one wanted to disturb. And Daniel Harper did not rush the ending. He let each note find its place, let each breath of sound linger just long enough to be felt, not just heard. And when the final note arrived, soft, steady, complete, it did not fall away, it stayed, suspended in the air as if the room itself refused to let it go. No one moved, no one spoke, because something had shifted in a way that words could not follow. And for the first time that evening, the people who had filled the space with noise, with expectation, with quiet judgment, sat in stillness, not forced, not instructed, but chosen, because they understood, even if they could not explain it, that what they had just witnessed was not performance, it was truth. Daniel kept his hands resting lightly on the keys, not claiming the moment, not reacting to it, because he had not played for them. He had played for something else, something quieter, something that did not need recognition. And slowly, he lifted his hands, the motion simple, unhurried, as if returning something that had never fully belonged to him. Sophie stepped closer, her small hand slipping into his, her eyes shining not with surprise, but with something deeper, something certain, and she looked up at him with a quiet smile that held no doubt, no question, just pride. And Daniel looked back at her, really looked this time. And in that moment, the weight he had carried for so long felt lighter, not gone, but changed, softened by something he had almost forgotten existed. Somewhere in the room, a single breath broke the silence, followed by another. And then, slowly, carefully, applause began, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, genuine, the kind that grows not from expectation, but from respect. And Daniel did not stand immediately, did not bow, did not acknowledge it the way the room might have expected. He simply turned slightly towards Sophie, his hand still holding hers, and gave a small nod, as if the moment had already said everything it needed to say. Claire stood near the front, her expression calm, but her eyes unmistakably changed, not impressed, not surprised, but certain, as if something she had believed quietly had just been proven without a single word. And she did not step forward, did not interrupt, because she understood that this was not her moment to shape. It was his moment to leave as it was. Daniel rose from the bench slowly, his posture steady, and for a brief second, he looked out at the room, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. And what he saw was not judgment, not dismissal, but something far quieter, something closer to understanding. And that was enough. He stepped away from the piano, Sophie beside him, their steps calm, unhurried, as the applause continued, not chasing them, not demanding anything more, just following, respectful. And as they reached the edge of the stage, Sophie looked up once more, her voice soft but clear. "You did not stop," she said. And Daniel let out a faint breath that almost became a smile. "No," he replied gently. "I just forgot who I was playing for." And as they walked back into the space he had once tried to remain invisible in, the room did not see him the same way anymore. But more importantly, he did not see himself the same way either, because sometimes dignity does not need to be proven. It only needs a moment to be heard. And in that moment, when the music faded and the silence returned, it carried something new, not emptiness, but respect.